Ethan Johnson sat quietly in his car, his fingers tapping lightly on the steering wheel. The building before him loomed large, glass reflecting the early morning sun. Johnson Innovations, his company, was a beacon of success in the tech world. For years, he had worked tirelessly to build it from the ground up, overcoming challenges and obstacles that few knew about. The company had grown into one of the most respected names in the industry, yet here he was, preparing for another day like any other, though he had learned long ago that every day brought its own battles. Ethan didn't dress to impress, he never felt the need to. His usual attire, simple button-down shirt and slacks, was enough for him, though it often left people second-guessing his status. Today was no different. He chuckled inwardly, recalling how often he'd walked into high-powered meetings, only for others to mistake him for a driver or assistant. Preconceptions, he knew, could be a powerful thing. Inside the building, Madison Taylor was organizing her desk for the day. She was a seasoned professional, having worked as the secretary for the executive office for over a decade. Madison was a stickler for protocol, ensuring everything and everyone followed the rules. Her blonde hair was tied back neatly, her glasses perched on her nose as she scanned through her schedule. She noticed an unfamiliar name on the agenda, Ethan Johnson. She frowned. There had been no photos attached, and the name wasn't ringing any bells. David Connor, the head of security, stopped by her desk to check in, as he did every morning. Tall and muscular, David took his job seriously, always prepared to handle any problems that might arise. The building's security was tight, and David took pride in ensuring nothing unusual ever disrupted the office. "Everything good?" Madison David asked, leaning casually against her desk. "Busy as usual," she replied, glancing at her screen. "We've got some important meetings today. I'm expecting a Mr. Ethan Johnson, but I don't have much information on him. Could be a vendor, or someone trying to push through another tech pitch." David nodded. "If there's any trouble, just let me know. You know I've got your back." Madison smiled, appreciating David's confidence. "Always do." Outside, Ethan checked his phone one last time before stepping out of the car. He was looking forward to the meeting today. His board of directors would be present, and they were set to discuss several major partnerships. As he walked toward the glass doors of his own company, he couldn't shake the feeling of pride that surged through him every time he entered the building. Upon entering, the lobby was bustling with employees heading to their respective departments. As Ethan approached the front desk, Madison glanced up, her face immediately hardening. She didn't recognize him, and her mind instantly clicked into guard mode. "Excuse me," Ethan said, offering her a polite smile. "I'm here for a meeting." Her gaze narrowed slightly. She scanned him, and her brain filled in the blanks. This man, a tall black man in a simple suit, didn't look like the kind of person who belonged in this building, at least not in her view. "And you are?" she asked, her tone clipped and professional, but there was an edge to it. "Ethan Johnson," he replied. Madison's fingers paused on the keyboard, her frown deepening. She couldn't recall seeing any details about someone like him, especially not with that name. "I don't have your name on the list," she said, her voice carrying a tinge of skepticism. "I'm the owner of the company," Ethan stated plainly, expecting this small confusion to be cleared up quickly. But Madison's eyebrow raised, her face displaying clear disbelief. "The owner," she repeated, her voice thick with sarcasm. She had heard many people claim things, but this one felt particularly outlandish. Madison's initial skepticism gave way to something colder. She stood up, folding her arms across her chest. "Look, Mr. Johnson," she said, emphasizing his name as though it were a joke. "I don't know what you're trying to pull, but this office is off-limits without proper credentials. If you don't leave, I'll have security escort you out." Ethan's patience, though tested, remained intact. He took a deep breath, holding back the frustration bubbling inside. This wasn't the first time someone had assumed he didn't belong in a place like this, but it always hurt just the same. "I understand there might be some confusion," Ethan said, his tone still calm. "But I can assure you, I am the owner. My name is on every document this company has signed. I don't need an appointment." Madison's eyes flickered with contempt. She barely glanced at his identification badge when he handed it over, dismissing it with a quick glance. "I'm going to have to call security," she said, her hand already reaching for the phone. Ethan sighed.
That won't be necessary!
Before he could finish, David Connor appeared, his imposing figure looming over them both. "Is there a problem, Madison?" Madison didn't hesitate. "This man claims he's the owner of the company," she said, her voice dripping with disbelief. Hez refusing to leave. David's face hardened as he looked at Ethan. Without saying a word, he stepped between Ethan and the office entrance, his posture stiff and unwelcoming. "Sir," David said gruffly, "I'm going to need you to leave. If you don't comply, I'll have to escort you out myself." Ethan clenched his jaw. He was used to keeping his temper in check, but this situation was quickly getting out of hand. He stood his ground, refusing to be pushed around. "I'm not leaving," he said firmly, meeting David's gaze. "I own this company, and I have every right to be here." David's hand twitched slightly, his body tensing as though preparing for a physical altercation. Madison's smug expression only fueled the tension. Ethan could feel the weight of the stares from employees passing by, watching the confrontation unfold with varying degrees of interest. "David, let's not escalate this," Ethan warned, his voice low but steady. David didn't respond. Instead, he placed a firm hand on Ethan's shoulder, ready to move him. "I said leave," David growled, his grip tightening. Ethan, refusing to be intimidated, stood his ground. "This is racism," he said, his voice unwavering. Madison let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Racism," she echoed. "I'm just doing my job. People like you aren't on any list of company owners." Ethan's body tensed, and for a moment he felt an overwhelming wave of anger and frustration. He'd built this company with his own hands, and yet here he was being treated like a criminal in his own building. Before he could respond, the scene took another turn. Ethan stood rooted to the spot as David's grip tightened on his shoulder. The physical touch was more than just forceful, it was degrading. The condescending smirk on Madison's face stung as much as the pressure from David's hand. She hadn't even bothered to check his identification properly, just saw what she expected to see. And to them, Ethan was nothing more than an intruder, an outsider in his own of. As if sensing his defiance, David gave Ethan's shoulder another firm squeeze. "I won't ask again," he said, his voice lowering into a more threatening growl. "You're leaving." Ethan fought to stay calm. Every fiber of his being screamed to shout back, to demand respect. But he knew that doing so wouldn't get him anywhere. It never did. He'd been in too many situations like this in his life. Reacting with anger would only make things worse, would reinforce every stereotype people like Madison and David were already clinging to. He had worked too hard to rise above that. "I'm not leaving until you acknowledge who I am," Ethan said, his voice tight but measured. "I've built this company from nothing. I employ all of you. And right now, you're treating me like I don't even deserve to walk through my own front door." David's face hardened, his grip not letting up. "Madison, get the police on the line," he instructed, without taking his eyes off Ethan. "Already on it," Madison replied, her fingers tapping briskly on her phone screen, a smirk still on her lips. She was clearly enjoying every moment of this power trip. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, willing himself to stay calm, though inside he was seething. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about something bigger. His whole life had been filled with people making assumptions about him based on his appearance. And here it was happening again, only this time in his own company. The injustice of it all made his stomach churn. David shoved him back a step, making his intent clear. Ethan wasn't welcome here, and he wouldn't stop until he was out the door. For a brief moment, Ethan considered leaving. What would be the point in arguing when they clearly weren't willing to listen? He could just let it go, step outside, and make a phone call to the board members who would immediately fix this. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized he couldn't walk away, not this time. Ethan straightened his jacket, carefully brushing David's hand off his shoulder. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly but firmly. David's eyes flashed with anger, and before Ethan could even blink, the security guard shoved him backward with both hands. The force was enough to catch Ethan off guard, causing him to stumble a few steps before regaining his balance. A couple of employees walking by stopped in their tracks, their eyes wide with shock. Some seemed horrified by what they were witnessing, while others quickly turned their gaze away, pretending not to see. "This is my final warning," David hissed, stepping forward with an air of superiority. "If you don't leave right now, I'm going to make sure you regret it." The humiliation weighed heavily on Ethan's chest, but his resolve hardened. There were times in life when standing your ground was the only option, and this was one of those moments. "I'm not leaving," Ethan said again, louder this time. His voice echoed through the lobby, catching the attention of even more employees. The office fell into an eerie silence. All eyes were on him now. Some looked curious, others uncomfortable. Ethan could feel their stares boring into him, and the weight of their collective indifference was suffocating. A few smirks spread across the faces of certain employees, people he had hired, people who should have known better. But they were enjoying the spectacle. Madison stepped out from behind her desk, phone in hand. "I'm calling the police now," she said coldly, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "And when they get here, I'll make sure they know you tried to force your way in with fake documents." The words hit Ethan like a punch in the gut. They were ready to ruin his reputation, paint him as a criminal, and possibly have him arrested in front of the entire office. All because of their assumptions. David moved forward again, his hand raised, ready to push Ethan out the door once more. But before he could lay a hand on him, a new voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" Ethan turned to see Michael Reeves, one of the company's senior managers, standing in the doorway of the conference room, his eyes wide with confusion. Michael was a tall, middle-aged man with salt-and-pepper hair and a reputation for being level-headed, even under pressure. His sharp blue suit contrasted with the stunned expression on his face as he surveyed the scene before him. "Michael," Madison said, her voice filled with condescension, "this man is trying to force his way into the office. He claims to be the owner of the company, but he refuses to provide proper identification. David's handling it." Michael's brow furrowed as his gaze shifted from Madison to David, and then finally landed on Ethan. For a split second, Michael's face paled as recognition dawned on him. He knew exactly who Ethan was. Horror spread across his features as he realized the magnitude of what was happening. "Wait!" Michael stammered, stepping forward, his hand raised as if to stop the scene from escalating any further. "Ethan." "Mr. Johnson?" The sound of Michael addressing him by name brought the room to a standstill. Employees who had been watching the confrontation with interest suddenly froze, their faces filled with confusion and discomfort. The smirks disappeared. David's grip loosened, and his hand slowly dropped to his side, the confidence draining from his posture. Madison's face, once filled with smug assurance, twisted into a look of shock and fear. She turned toward Michael, her eyes wide. "Mr. Johnson," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes," Ethan said, his tone icy. "Ethan Johnson, the owner of this company." Michael, his face pale, swallowed hard. "Oh my God," he muttered under his breath, taking another step toward Ethan. "Mr. Johnson?" Too had no idea. Ethan didn't move. His entire body was tense, the humiliation still raw. He wasn't ready to let them off the hook just yet. "Is this how you treat your employer?" he asked, his voice cold and cutting. "Is this how you treat the person who built this company from the ground up?" The silence in the office was deafening. Madison's hands trembled as she fumbled with her phone, suddenly realizing the enormity of her mistake. David took a step back, his face flushed with embarrassment, his earlier bravado gone. I didn't know," Madison stammered, her voice trembling. I thought you were—" Ethan raised a hand to stop her. "You thought I was what he asked," his voice calm but filled with an underlying edge of anger. "An imposter, a criminal, someone who didn't belong." Madison's mouth opened, but no words came out. The full weight of what she had done was crashing down on her, and there was no escaping it. She had treated him like an outsider, humiliated him in front of the entire office, all because of her assumptions about who he was, and more importantly, who she thought he was. David, too, stood frozen, unable to find any words to explain his actions. His role in this mess was undeniable, and he knew it. Michael stepped forward again, his hands raised in a gesture of apology. "Mr. Johnson, I am so sorry," he said, his voice shaking slightly. This is a terrible misunderstanding. Please, let me— Ethan cut him off. A misunderstanding, he repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. This wasn't a misunderstanding, Michael. This was a blatant display of racism and ignorance. And I'm not going to just let it slide. The finality of his words hung in the air like a storm cloud, ready to burst. The office remained frozen, caught between shock and silence. Ethan's words seemed to echo through the space, cutting into the cold stares of those who had watched the confrontation unfold. He had never raised his voice, but his calm fury resonated in every corner of the room. Everyone knew something had gone terribly wrong, but the aftermath had only just begun. Madison swallowed, her face still drained of color. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out at first. She stood there, trembling, her eyes darting between Ethan and the employees who had been witnesses to her actions. David, still beside her, shifted uneasily, his shoulders stiff as though trying to hide behind his own authority. I didn't know, Mr. Johnson, Madison finally managed, her voice shaking. Ethan held up a hand, cutting her off before she could finish. You didn't know because you didn't bother to listen, he said, his voice sharp but controlled. You didn't check the facts. You didn't look beyond your own assumptions. Her gaze dropped to the floor, shame and guilt flooding her features. The realization that she had humiliated the owner of the company, her boss, was only beginning to sink in. But it was more than that. It wasn't just about her mistake. It was about why she had made it in the first place. David finally spoke, his voice gruff but strained. I was just doing my job, he muttered, though his tone lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. I thought? You thought I didn't belong here? Ethan interrupted, his voice cutting through David's excuses. You saw a black man walking into an office, and you assumed he couldn't possibly be the owner of the company. David's jaw tightened, and for a brief moment it looked like he might argue. But the weight of the situation finally seemed to catch up with him, and he closed his mouth, unable to meet Ethan's gaze. The silence that followed was suffocating. The tension in the room was unbearable as everyone waited for what would happen next. The office staff, who had either watched passively or actively enjoyed the spectacle, suddenly looked uncomfortable. No one moved. No one spoke. But the truth of what had just happened was clear to everyone. Michael Reeves, still standing awkwardly nearby, took a deep breath and stepped forward. Mr. Johnson, he said carefully, I want to apologize on behalf of the company. This should never have happened. Ethan turned to him, his expression unreadable. No, it shouldn't have, he replied coldly. But it did. Michael nodded, his face tense with concern. Please, let's handle this in the boardroom. We can sort everything out. Ethan hesitated, the anger still simmering just beneath the surface. He could see the discomfort in Michael's eyes, the desperate attempt to regain control of a situation that had already spiraled out of hand. But this wasn't just a personal issue anymore, it was a much larger problem. He glanced around the office, catching the eyes of a few employees who quickly looked away. He could feel the weight of their indifference. Some had smirked when David had shoved him, while others had watched without saying a word. It wasn't just Madison or David. The entire office had contributed to this toxic culture in some way. Ethan took a deep breath and nodded. Fine. Let's go. The walk to the boardroom was silent, but the weight of the tension followed them like a shadow. As they entered, Michael quickly closed the door behind them, leaving Madison and David standing in the hallway, looking as though they were waiting for a verdict on their fates. The boardroom was sleek and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city skyline. Ethan had spent years building this company, designing every corner of this office to reflect innovation, excellence, and progress. But at that moment, none of it mattered. What mattered was how deep-rooted the prejudice was within the walls he had built. Michael sat at the table, his posture tense. He clasped his hands together, his fingers tapping nervously on the polished wood surface. Mr. Johnson, he began slowly, this incident, it's unacceptable. I want you to know that we will take every action necessary to address it. Ethan remained standing, his arms crossed. Address it, he repeated. You think firing Madison and David will solve this? Michael hesitated, unsure how to proceed. Well, I think disciplinary action would— That won't fix the problem, Ethan interrupted. This isn't just about two people. This is about a culture that's allowed this kind of thinking to thrive. I'm the owner of this company, and I was treated like a trespasser. What does that say about how my employees see me? What does that say about the values we claim to stand for? Michael blinked, taken aback by the weight of Ethan's words. I understand, he said slowly. You're right. This goes deeper than just this incident. Ethan nodded, though the tension in his shoulders remained. I don't want a quick fix. I want systemic change. This can't happen again, not to me, not to anyone else who walks through these doors. Michael nodded, clearly struggling to come up with the right words. What do you want us to do? He asked, his voice tentative. Ethan was silent for a long moment, thinking. His anger hadn't faded, but he knew that his response needed to be more than just personal satisfaction. It needed to create lasting change. We start with accountability, Ethan said finally. Not just for Madison and David, but for everyone. We need to take a hard look at our hiring practices, our office culture, and how we handle situations like this. We need diversity training, not the superficial kind, but real, meaningful training that addresses the biases people hold, whether they realize it or not. Michael nodded slowly. I can make that happen, he said. Well, implement new policies, bring in experts to train the staff, and ensure that everyone understands what's at stake. Ethan sighed, feeling some of the tension begin to leave his body. Good, he said, though his voice was still heavy with emotion. But this isn't going to be easy. You know that, right? Michael's expression softened. I know. But it's necessary. After the meeting, Ethan sat alone in his office, staring out the window at the city below. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the buildings. His mind was racing, replaying the events of the day over and over again. The anger he had felt earlier was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it was now mixed with something else, something deeper and more unsettling. He had built this company from nothing. He had put in long hours, sacrificed time with his family, and poured his heart and soul into making it a success. But today had shown him something he hadn't been willing to face. Despite all his achievements, despite all his hard work, he was still seen by some as less than, as an outsider who didn't belong. Ethan's thoughts drifted to his childhood, growing up in a world where he was constantly told he would never amount to anything. His teachers had underestimated him, his peers had bullied him, and even his own community had doubted him at times. But he had proved them all wrong. He had defied the odds, beaten the statistics, and risen to the top of an industry that wasn't built for people like him. And yet here he was being questioned, doubted, and disrespected in the very place he had created. The injustice of it all made his chest ache. He had faced racism before, but this was different. This was personal. This was in his home, his company, his safe space. It was a reminder that no matter how far he had come, no matter how successful he became, there were still people who would judge him based on the color of his skin rather than the content of his character. He thought about Madison and David, their smug faces as they had tried to throw him out of the building. They hadn't even bothered to check his credentials properly. They had seen him and made up their minds. He was black, therefore he couldn't possibly be the owner. That was the assumption, and they had acted on it without hesitation. Ethan felt his fists clench in his lap. He had every right to fire them both on the spot. He had every right to demand that they be removed from the company entirely. But as satisfying as that might have been in the moment, he knew it wouldn't solve the larger problem. It wouldn't fix the culture that had allowed them to feel so confident in their prejudice. It wouldn't change the minds of the people who had stood by and watched, without saying a word. No, Ethan realized, this wasn't just about Madison and David. This was about a system that needed to be dismantled, piece by piece. Madison sat in the small break room, her hands trembling as she stared at the cold cup of coffee in front of her. The reality of what had happened was finally sinking in, and the shame was overwhelming. She had been so sure of herself, so certain that she was doing the right thing. But now, in the aftermath, she could see how wrong she had been. How had she let this happen? How had she allowed her assumptions to cloud her judgment so completely? She thought back to the moment Ethan had walked into the office. She had taken one look at him and decided, in that instant, that he didn't belong. She hadn't even considered the possibility that he might be telling the truth. She hadn't bothered to check his identification properly or give him the benefit of the doubt. She had just assumed, based on nothing more than his appearance, that he was lying. And now she had humiliated her boss, the owner of the company, in front of everyone. Madison felt sick. She had always prided herself on being a good employee, someone who followed the rules and did her job well. But today, she had failed in the most spectacular way possible. She had let her biases, she hadn't even realized she had controlled her actions. And in doing so, she had contributed to the very system of prejudice and racism she had always claimed to oppose. What had happened to her? How had she become the kind of person she had always despised? Tears welled up in her eyes, and she quickly wiped them away, not wanting anyone to see. But the guilt was too heavy to push aside. She had to face the truth. She had failed Ethan. She had failed her company. And she had failed herself. The tension that hung over Johnson Innovations the day after Ethan, Madison, and David. For Madison, the weight of her actions felt unbearable. She had barely slept the night before, tossing and turning as shame and guilt clawed at her mind. When she arrived at work that morning, it was as if she could feel the judgment from her colleagues. She could barely make eye contact with anyone. Her hands trembled as she tried to do her tasks, but the mundane work that once grounded her now felt me. Finally, as the day dragged on, Michael Reeves, K.A., Madison walked in, her legs feeling like lead. Michael sat behind his desk, looking weary. His expression was difficult to read, somewhere between disappointment and unday. "Madison, sit down," he said, his voice tight but not unkind. She did as he asked, but couldn't bring herself to look him in the eye. "You know why we're here," Michael said after a long pause. "Yesterday's incident. What you did, what David did, it can't go." "I know," Madison whispered. Her voice was barely audible, but the shame was clear. I didn't mean for it to go that far. I thought I was doing my job, but you didn't do your job." "Mad." Michael sighed. Madison nodded. Michael studied her for a moment, his gaze softening. "That's what I hoped you'd say," he replied. "Ethan's asked for systemic changes to be made, not just to punish individuals, but to change the culture of this company. He doesn't want to just fire you or David and pretend the problem is solved. He wants real change. And that means we're going to need your help." Madison blinked, taken aback. "My help," she echoed. She had expected to be fired, or at the very least demoted. The idea that she could play a part in fixing what she had broken seemed almost unbelievable. "Yes," Michael said firmly. "You need to take responsibility for what happened. You need to help lead the effort to make sure it never happens again. That means participating in the diversity and inclusion training we're implementing, working with a task force to identify problem areas in our company culture, and confronting your own biases. Are you willing to do that?" Madison nodded quickly. "Yes, absolutely. I want to help. I don't want to be the person I was yesterday. I don't want to make that mistake ever again." Michael smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good, because this isn't going to be easy, Madison. It's going to take time, and it's going to require a lot of uncomfortable conversations. But it's the only way we move forward." Madison left the office feeling a mix of relief and dread. She had been given a second chance, but now came the hard part, facing the consequences of her actions and working to repair the damage. The days following Ethan's company-wide meeting were tense. As the new Diversity and Inclusion Initiative rolled out, the atmosphere at Johnson Innovations began to shift. Some employees welcomed the changes, eager to engage in the new training and discussions. Others, however, bristled at what they perceived to be an overreaction, whispering among themselves in break rooms and hallways. Ethan watched the reactions carefully. He knew that true change would take time and that resistance was inevitable. But he hadn't expected the backlash to be as vocal as it became. In online forums and private chat groups, employees vented their frustrations. Some felt that the diversity training was forced and politically correct nonsense. Others were more direct, openly mocking the initiative and dismissing it as nothing more than a PR move. The training sessions themselves were tense, with many attendees disengaged or rolling their eyes, waiting for it to be over. At the same time, some employees were emboldened to speak out, sharing stories of microaggressions they had experienced within the company. Linda Perez, who had been tasked with leading the diversity initiative, found herself fielding an overwhelming number of complaints and reports of inappropriate behavior. The floodgates had opened, and the company was beginning to reckon with years of buried tension. One afternoon, Marcus Sullivan, the head of the marketing department, requested a private meeting with Ethan. Marcus had been with the company for nearly a decade, and Ethan had always considered him a loyal and level-headed employee. But as Marcus sat down in Ethan's office, his face was set in a tight, uncomfortable expression. "Ethan, I've always respected you," Marcus began, his voice measured. "I've admired what you've built here. But I have to be honest, I think this whole diversity push is going too far." Ethan leaned back in his chair, sensing where the conversation was headed. "What do you mean, Marcus?" Marcus shifted in his seat. "I get that what happened was wrong. No one's saying it wasn't. But we're a tech company. We're supposed to focus on innovation, on staying ahead of the competition. All this talk about race and bias, it's distracting. People are starting to feel like they can't say anything without being judged." Ethan's jaw tightened, though he kept his voice calm. "So you think addressing racism and bias in our workplace is a distraction?" Marcus hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the directness of Ethan's question. "I think it's taking away from the work we're supposed to be doing. People are walking on eggshells. And honestly, some of us feel like we're being blamed for things that aren't our fault." Ethan's heart sank. He had expected some resistance, but hearing it from someone he respected was difficult. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Marcus, I understand that this is uncomfortable. Change always is. But this isn't just about what happened to me. It's about the culture we've built here. People are feeling silenced, not because we're talking about race, but because they've been dealing with these issues in silence for years." Marcus shifted uncomfortably again but didn't respond. "We can't be the kind of company that ignores these problems just because they're hard to talk about," Ethan continued. "If we want to lead the industry, we have to lead in more than just tech. We have to be a place where everyone feels valued and heard. That's what real innovation looks like." Marcus sighed, nodding slowly. "I get it. I do. I just hope we can find a balance. I don't want us to lose sight of the bigger picture." Ethan smiled faintly, though the conversation left a bitter taste in his mouth. "This is the bigger picture, Marcus. We can't separate the two." As Marcus left the office, Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring out the window. He knew the path ahead was going to be long and difficult. But as much as it hurt to hear resistance from his own team, he also knew that pushing forward was the only option. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about creating a company and a world where everyone could thrive. That evening, Ethan returned home feeling drained. Lauren greeted him at the door, immediately sensing the weight on his shoulders. She wrapped her arms around him, pulling him into a tight hug. "You look like you've been through the ringer," she said softly, kissing him on the cheek. Ethan sighed, leaning into her warmth. "It's been a rough day. The backlash is worse than I expected. Some people just don't get it. They think all this is a distraction, that we're focusing on the wrong things." Lauren led him to the living room, where they both sat down on the couch. She took his hand, her eyes filled with concern. "I'm sorry, Ethan. I know this isn't easy." He shook his head. "It's not about me, though. It's about the bigger picture, about creating the kind of company I always wanted. But sometimes I feel like no matter what I do, I'm fighting an uphill battle. There are people who just don't want to change." Lauren squeezed his hand. "You've always been a fighter, Ethan. That's one of the things I love about you. But I know how hard it is when the people around you resist the very changes you're trying to make." Ethan looked at her, grateful for her support, but also knowing that he needed to hear the truth. "Am I pushing too hard?" he asked quietly. "Am I expecting too much from them?" Lauren shook her head, her expression firm. "No, you're not. But you also have to understand that people are scared. Change threatens the way they see themselves, the way they see the world. You're asking them to confront things they've never had to confront before. That's hard, Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. I just don't know if I'm doing this the right way. I don't want to alienate people, but at the same time, I can't let this slide. I have to hold them accountable. Lauren smiled softly. And you will. But remember, accountability doesn't have to be harsh. It can be compassionate, too. Sometimes the best way to bring people along is to show them that you're not just punishing them, you're giving them a chance to grow. Ethan nodded, letting her words sink in. You're right. I guess I just need to find that balance. Lauren leaned in, kissing him gently on the forehead. You will. You always do. Over the next few weeks, the new diversity initiatives began to take root. The initial resistance slowly started to fade, as more employees began to engage with the training and the discussions that followed. Ethan made it a point to attend several of the sessions himself, not as a boss, but as a participant, sharing his own experiences and listening to those of his employees. At first, many were hesitant to speak up, unsure of how their stories would be received. But as the weeks went on, people began to open up. Sarah from accounting talked about the subtle biases she had faced as a woman of color in a predominantly white industry. Carlos, a senior developer, shared how he had always felt like he had to work twice as hard to prove himself because of his Hispanic background. Linda, the intern who had initially hesitated during Ethan's ordeal, shared her own story of feeling powerless in the face of discrimination, and how watching the incident with Ethan had shaken her to the core. These conversations were difficult, but they were also necessary. Slowly, the office culture began to shift. The mockery that had once surrounded the diversity initiative started to disappear. People who had initially resisted the training found themselves listening more, asking questions, and reflecting on their own biases. Even Madison, who had been at the center of the controversy, began to change. She threw herself into the diversity task force, working with Linda and HR to implement new policies that would prevent similar incidents from happening in the future. She attended every training session, often staying afterward to ask questions and seek advice on how to be better. Her transformation didn't go unnoticed. Some employees were skeptical at first, unwilling to believe that someone who had acted so dismissively could truly change. But over time, her sincerity became clear. She was really trying to confront the prejudices she hadn't even realized she held. Ethan kept a close eye on the progress, watching as the culture of his company began to evolve into something he could be proud of. But he knew the journey was far from over. There would still be setbacks, still moments of resistance. Changing hearts and minds was a long process, one that wouldn't happen overnight. As the company began to heal, Ethan found himself facing an unexpected challenge. The more he pushed for change within the company, the more attention it garnered in the outside world. Media outlets began to pick up on the story, painting Ethan as a symbol of corporate responsibility and racial justice. At first, the attention was positive praise for his leadership and his commitment to creating a more inclusive workplace. But as the media coverage grew, so did the scrutiny. A few conservative commentators began to criticize him, accusing him of caving to political correctness and forcing his employees into diversity brainwashing. They mocked the changes he was making, arguing that focusing on issues of race and bias was unnecessary and divisive. The online comments were brutal, filled with racist undertones and personal attacks. Ethan tried to brush it off, but it wasn't easy. He had faced criticism before, but this felt different. It wasn't just about him, it was about the cause he was fighting for. And the more backlash he received, the more he began to question whether he was doing the right thing. One night, after reading yet another scathing article about his diversity agenda, Ethan found himself spiraling. The words of his critics echoed in his mind, feeding into his doubts. Was he really making a difference, or was he just stirring up more division? He sat alone in his home office, the light from his computer screen casting long shadows on the walls. His heart felt heavy, weighed down by the enormity of what he was trying to do. For the first time in a long while, he wondered if he had taken on more than he could handle. But then, a notification popped up on his phone, a message from Linda. "Thank you for what you're doing. It's making a difference, even if it doesn't always feel like it. We're all behind you. Ethan stared at the message for a long moment, feeling a surge of emotion. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes, letting the doubt slip away. He wasn't alone in this fight, and he wasn't going to give up. Ethan stood in the center of the boardroom, his gaze steady as he looked around at the gathered executives. They had all been summoned for an urgent meeting, the culmination of weeks of tension, progress, and growing resistance. This was it, the moment where the future of Johnson Innovations would be decided. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. At the long conference table, Marcus Sullivan, Linda Perez, Michael Reeves, and several other department heads sat, each with varying expressions. Some were supportive, others hesitant, and a few visibly uncomfortable. Ethan knew that what he was about to say would either cement his authority and the company's new direction, or it would break everything apart. He hadn't planned on making this meeting so soon, but the pressure had been building. With external media criticism escalating and internal resistance from people like Marcus simmering, it was time to take a firm stand. His employees needed to hear from him directly, and the executives, those responsible for maintaining the company's direction, needed to understand what was at stake. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," Ethan began, his voice calm but filled with purpose. He placed his hands on the back of the chair in front of him, scanning the room. "I won't waste time getting to the point. What we're doing here, the changes we've been implementing are not optional. They are necessary, and they are permanent." He could see Marcus shift in his seat, arms crossed, his jaw tight. It was no secret that Marcus had been quietly vocal about his dissatisfaction with the diversity initiative. Several other department heads had expressed similar sentiments in private, but Marcus was the one who seemed most eager to push back. "I know some of you think we've gone too far," Ethan continued, acknowledging the tension in the room. "I know that these changes have made some of you uncomfortable. But let me be absolutely clear, this is the future of Johnson Innovations. If you can't get behind that, if you're unwilling to grow with us, then this may not be the right place for you." The room went silent. The weight of his words hung in the air, and Ethan saw several people shift uneasily in their seats. Marcus, however, didn't stay silent for long. He leaned forward, his expression tight with frustration. "Ethan, I respect everything you've done for this company. But I just don't think this is what we should be focusing on. We're a tech company, not a social justice movement. These diversity policies are alienating some of our best employees. They feel like they're being punished for things they didn't do." A murmur of agreement came from David Tran, the head of IT, who had also expressed doubts about the company's direction. Ethan remained calm, though his eyes narrowed slightly. "Marcus, no one is being punished. What we're doing is creating a workplace where everyone can thrive, where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued. If that makes some people uncomfortable, then maybe they should take a hard look at why they feel that way." Marcus shook his head, clearly unsatisfied. "I've heard complaints from people who say they feel like they're walking on eggshells. They're afraid to speak their minds because they don't want to say the wrong thing. We're stifling innovation with all these new rules. People aren't coming to work to talk about race or gender, they're here to build products." Ethan felt a surge of frustration, but he kept it in check. He knew that Marcus wasn't the only one who felt this way, and this was his chance to address the entire room to make it clear where he stood. "This isn't about stifling innovation," Ethan replied, his voice measured but firm. "It's about creating an environment where everyone can bring their full selves to work, without fear of being judged, marginalized, or mistreated. If people are walking on eggshells, it's because they've never had to think about the impact of their words or actions before. And maybe that's a good thing." He let the words sink in for a moment before continuing. "We can't pretend that the issues of race, gender, and bias don't affect our work. They do, every day. If we want to be leaders in innovation, we have to be leaders in how we treat people. We have to be willing to look at ourselves, to confront our own biases, and to make changes where they're needed. That's what leadership is." Linda, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke up, her voice calm but supportive. "I agree with Ethan. We can't just ignore the culture of our workplace. It impacts everything we do. If we're not willing to make this place more inclusive, we're going to lose out on talent on perspectives that can help us grow as a company. There was a murmur of agreement from some of the other executives, but Marcus still looked unsatisfied. He leaned back in his chair, shaking his head slightly. "I just don't think this is the right focus," Marcus muttered. "I think we're losing sight of what made this company successful in the first place." Ethan looked directly at Marcus, his gaze steady. "What made this company successful was our ability to innovate, to push boundaries, and to be better than the competition. That's what we're doing now. We're pushing boundaries. We're creating something better not just for our bottom line, but for our people. And if you can't see that, Marcus, then maybe you don't belong here anymore." The room went completely silent. Everyone seemed to hold their breath, waiting for Marcus' response. Marcus stared at Ethan, his face a mixture of shock and disbelief. He opened his mouth as if to argue, but then stopped himself. He knew there was no point in continuing the fight. The decision had already been made. After a long moment, Marcus stood up from his chair, pushing it back with a scrape. "I see where this is going," he said, his voice low but resigned. "I guess I'll be submitting my resignation." He turned and walked out of the boardroom without another word. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Ethan stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of what had just happened. It wasn't easy to lose a longtime colleague, but he knew it was necessary. This was the turning point the company needed. He turned back to the rest of the room, his expression firm but not unkind. "I'm not asking for blind loyalty," he said, his voice steady. "I'm asking for commitment to something bigger than ourselves. If you're with me, then we're going to make this company better than it's ever been. But if you can't be part of that, then you need to make your decision now." There was a long pause as everyone absorbed his words. One by one, the executives began to nod, some more reluctantly than others. But the message was clear: Ethan wasn't backing down. After the boardroom showdown, there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere at Johnson Innovations. Marcus' resignation sent shockwaves through the company. Some employees were surprised, others relieved, but most recognized that it signaled a new era. Ethan's firm stance had made it clear that the company was moving forward, with or without those who resisted the changes. Ethan knew that the road ahead would still be difficult. He had lost a valuable executive, and no doubt some others might follow Marcus' lead. But the alternative, allowing the company's toxic culture to persist, wasn't an option. As the days passed, Ethan found himself reflecting on the cost of leadership. He had never wanted to alienate anyone, but he understood that progress often came at a price. He had been willing to pay it. And now, he hoped it would lead to the kind of workplace he had always envisioned, one where everyone felt seen, valued, and respected. Among those who had taken Ethan's words to heart was Madison. She had been attending every diversity training session, working closely with Linda and HR to ensure that the new policies were being implemented properly. The guilt she had felt after the incident with Ethan had never fully gone away, but now she was determined to make amends, not just to Ethan, but to herself. One afternoon, Madison approached Ethan's office, nervously clutching a folder filled with reports and notes from the Diversity Task Force. She knocked on the door lightly, her heart racing. When Ethan called her in, she stepped inside, feeling a wave of apprehension wash over her. Ethan looked up from his desk, surprised to see her. "Madison," he said, his tone neutral, "what can I do for you?" She swallowed hard, forcing herself to speak. I just wanted to show you what we've been working on," she said, holding out the folder. "The Diversity Task Force. I thought you might want to see the progress we've made." Ethan took the folder, glancing through the reports. After a moment, he nodded, impressed by the thoroughness of the work. "This looks good," he said, looking up at her. "You've been working hard." Madison nodded, still feeling a knot of anxiety in her chest. "I've made a lot of mistakes," she said quietly, "but I'm trying to do better. I want to make things right." Ethan studied her for a moment, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. He could sense how much this meant to her, how much she had changed since the incident. "I appreciate that, Madison," he said, his voice softening. "It takes courage to admit when you've been wrong, and it takes even more courage to change." She smiled faintly, the knot in her chest loosening just a bit. "Thank you," she whispered, grateful for his understanding. As she left the office, Madison felt a sense of relief wash over her. She wasn't perfect, she still had a lot to learn, but she was on the right path. And that, for now, was enough. In the weeks that followed, Johnson Innovations continued to evolve. The backlash from the diversity initiative gradually subsided, and the culture of the company began to shift toward a more inclusive, respectful environment. Employees who had once been indifferent or resistant now found themselves more open to the conversations taking place. The office felt different, more alive, more connected. Ethan, for the first time in months, felt a renewed sense of hope.
The weight that had been pressing down on him since the incident was slowly lifting.
He had taken a stand for what he believed in, and while the journey had been difficult, he knew it had been worth it. One evening, as he stood in his office overlooking the city, Ethan allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He thought about everything that had brought him to this point, the struggles, the setbacks, the painful moments of doubt. But through it all, he had stayed true to his values, his vision for what Johnson Innovations could be. And now, standing on the other side of the storm, he could see the future clearly. He wasn't done yet. There was still work to be done, still battles to fight. But for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt like he wasn't fighting alone. He turned off the lights in his office and headed home, ready to face whatever came next. Weeks passed, and Johnson Innovations settled into its new rhythm. The tension that had once filled the office now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by a growing sense of collaboration and purpose. The company was moving forward not just in terms of innovation and technology, but in the culture that underpinned it. Ethan could feel the change in the air, and it was something he hadn't fully anticipated. The workplace wasn't just running more smoothly, it was alive with new ideas, new perspectives, and a renewed sense of community. The new diversity and inclusion policies had taken root, and the task forced by Madison and Linda was thriving. Employees who had once resisted the changes now found themselves more engaged, asking questions and participating in the discussions. The once estony silence around issues of race, bias, and inequality had cracked open, allowing for the kind of honest conversations Ethan had always hoped to foster. As Ethan walked through the office one afternoon, he saw small signs of progress everywhere. Sarah from accounting was leading a group discussion on workplace microaggressions, drawing on her own experiences to educate others. Carlos, the senior developer, was mentoring new hires from diverse backgrounds, helping them navigate the industry with the kind of support he had never had. Even the quieter employees who had initially seemed indifferent were stepping up, contributing to the broader conversation about what kind of company they wanted to be. Ethan couldn't help but smile as he made his way back to his office. There had been moments when he wasn't sure if this kind of change was possible, but now it was happening right in front of him. The company he had built was becoming more than just a tech firm. It was becoming a community, a place where people felt they could bring their full selves to work. As he sat down at his desk, Ethan's phone buzzed with a message. It was from Lauren. "I'm proud of you. You've come so far." Ethan smiled as he read the words, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. He knew that none of this would have been possible without her support. She had been his rock through it all, the moments of doubt, the sleepless nights, the difficult decisions. And now, on the other side of it, he could finally see the fruits of their labor. He typed back a quick response, "Thank you. I couldn't have done it without you." Madison sat in her office, staring at the document in front of her. It was the final draft of the Diversity and Inclusion Report, a comprehensive review of the progress the company had made over the past few months. She had poured her heart into it, working late nights and attending every training session she could. This report wasn't just a reflection of the company's progress, it was a reflection of her own growth. There were times when Madison still felt the weight of what she had done to Ethan, the shame of how she had acted in that terrible moment. But she had come to realize that shame in itself wasn't enough. It wasn't about wallowing in guilt. It was about learning from her mistakes and making sure she never repeated them. She had taken responsibility, and now she was doing everything in her power to contribute to the solution. The diversity task force had become her passion. She worked closely with Linda and HR to implement new policies, create safe spaces for conversations, and ensure that the company's commitment to inclusivity wasn't just a passing phase. It was becoming part of the company's DNA, and that meant everything to her. As she finished reading through the final section of the report, Madison felt a surge of pride. She had come. Edith looked thoughtful, her eyes distant. "I've been thinking about it a lot, and I think it's time to let go of the house. It's too much for me now. I've held on to it because of Harold, but I think it's time." Luke's heart ached at the sadness in her voice, but he knew she was right. Edith had spent so many years in that house, filling it with memories of her life with Harold. But now she needed a new beginning, a fresh start, where she could focus on her health and well-being. "We'll find you a good place," Luke said softly. "Somewhere where you'll be comfortable and well taken care of. And I'll visit you every day." Edith smiled at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I know you will." In the weeks that followed, Luke and Edith worked together to find a care facility where she could live comfortably while receiving the medical support she needed. It wasn't an easy decision, but Edith felt at peace with it. She knew she wasn't saying goodbye to the life she had built in Riverbrook. She was simply starting a new chapter. The day Edith moved into the facility, Luke was by her side, helping her settle in and bringing her familiar items from home: her favorite quilt, a framed photo of her and Harold, and a stack of books she loved. The room was small but cozy, with a view of a garden outside the window. Edith seemed at ease, and Luke felt a sense of relief knowing she was in a place where she would be cared for. As he sat with her that afternoon, watching the sunlight stream through the window, Luke realized just how much Edith had come to mean to him. She wasn't just a resident on his mail route, she was family. And no matter what the future held, he would be there for her, just as she had always been there for him. Several months had passed since Edith had moved into her new home, and life in Riverbrook had returned to its quiet rhythm. The seasons had changed, bringing the warmth of summer to the town. Luke continued his mail route, greeting the familiar faces of the town's residents and enjoying the simple pleasures of his routine. But there was something different, now a deeper connection to the community and a sense of purpose that went beyond delivering mail. Every afternoon, Luke visited Edith at the care facility. They spent hours talking, laughing, and reminiscing about the past. Edith had made new friends at the facility, and her health had stabilized. She was still undergoing treatment for her cancer, but she was stronger now, and there was a lightness in her spirit that hadn't been there before. One sunny afternoon, as Luke sat with Edith in the garden outside the facility, she turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "You know, Luke," she said softly, "I've been thinking a lot about how lucky I am. I've had a good life, but what I'm most grateful for is the people I've met along the way, people like you." Luke smiled, his heart full of warmth. "I'm the lucky one, Edith. You've taught me so much about resilience, about kindness, about what it means to really care about someone." Edith reached out and took his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You saved me, Luke. Not just my life, but my spirit. I was lost for a long time, but you helped me find my way back." Luke felt tears prick his eyes, but he blinked them away, squeezing her hand in return. "We helped each other." As they sat there in the warm afternoon sun, surrounded by the scent of blooming flowers and the soft rustling of leaves, Luke realized that he had found something he hadn't even known he was looking for: a sense of belonging, a deeper connection to the people around him, and a renewed understanding of what it meant to be part of a community. The story of Edith's struggle and her eventual recovery had touched more lives than either of them could have imagined. The people of Riverbrook had rallied around her, showing what it meant to truly care for one another. And in the process, they had reminded Luke of the importance of small, everyday acts of kindness, the kind of kindness that could save lives. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the garden, Edith leaned back in her chair, her eyes twinkling with contentment. "It's a beautiful day," she said softly. Luke nodded, his heart full. "It really is." And in that moment, Luke knew that no matter what the future held, he and Edith would face it together. surrounded by the strength of their community and the unbreakable bond they had formed. Sometimes, the most unexpected connections can shape our lives in profound ways. If you've been moved by this story and want to hear more heartwarming tales like this one, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any future updates. Every story has the power to inspire, and we have plenty more to share with you. Join us on this journey of storytelling, empathy, and community. Be a part of something bigger by subscribing, and together we can spread positivity, one story at a time. Let me know how it goes. In the months that followed, Ryan spearheaded a new task force within the department aimed at ensuring the responsible use of technology in policing. The Ethical Policing Technology Initiative (EPTI) was designed to oversee how new tools were implemented, making sure they adhered to strict privacy standards and weren't being used in a discriminatory manner. Ryan worked closely with civil liberties groups, tech experts, and community leaders to develop guidelines that ensured transparency and accountability. Officers were required to undergo specialized training on how to use these tools ethically, and new oversight measures were put in place to monitor their deployment. The program wasn't without its critics. Some officers complained that the new rules made their jobs harder, while certain tech companies pushed back against what they saw as unnecessary restrictions. But Ryan stood firm, knowing that without proper oversight, the technology could do more harm than good. During one particularly tense department meeting, an officer raised his hand, frustration evident in his voice. "With all due respect, Deputy Chief," he began, "why are we handcuffing ourselves? This technology can help us catch criminals faster. Why put so many restrictions on it?" Ryan met the officer's gaze, understanding the concern but remaining resolute. "Because our job isn't just to catch criminals," he said. "Our job is to protect the people, and that means protecting their rights, too. If we start sacrificing privacy and civil liberties in the name of efficiency, then we're not doing our jobs. We're just cutting corners." The room was silent for a moment, and Ryan could see the wheels turning in the officer's mind. It was a tough balancing act, but Ryan knew it was necessary. The future of policing wasn't about brute force or unchecked surveillance. It was about thoughtful, ethical approaches that respected the people they served. 2 years later, the Ethical Policing Technology Initiative had become a model for departments across the country. Ryan had been invited to speak at several national conferences, sharing the lessons they had learned about balancing public safety with civil liberties. The success of the initiative had solidified his reputation as a forward-thinking leader in law enforcement reform. Jordan, too, had continued his advocacy work, pushing for nationwide adoption of similar standards. The two men, despite their different approaches, remained close friends and collaborators, each pushing the other to do better. One evening, after a long day, Ryan received a message from Jordan dinner at my place. When Ryan arrived, Jordan was already grilling steaks on the back porch. The smell of sizzling meat filled the air as they sat down to catch up. "You know, I never thought we'd be here," Jordan said as they ate. "When we started all this, I didn't think we'd actually get to a point where the system would listen to us." Ryan smiled. "I think we both underestimated the power of persistence." Jordan laughed. "You're right about that. But we're not done yet, are we?" "No," Ryan said, his tone serious. "We're not. But we're making progress." They clinked their beer bottles together, a silent toast to the years of hard work and the victories they had earned. The road had been long and filled with obstacles, but they had made a difference one step at a time. As the sun set over the city, casting a warm glow over the skyline, Ryan and Jordan sat in comfortable silence, watching the world they had helped shape. The challenges they had faced, the battles they had fought, had all been worth it. They had built something lasting, something that would continue long after they were gone. Ryan couldn't help but think about the young officers coming up through the ranks, the ones who would carry on the work he had started. Officers like Naomi Green, who now led a unit focused on community engagement, were the future of policing. They represented a new generation that believed in fairness, justice, and the importance of doing things the right way. "I think the future's in good hands," Ryan said, more to himself than to Jordan. Jordan looked over at him, his expression thoughtful. Yeah, I think it is. The two men sat back, content in the knowledge that while their work was never truly done, they had laid a foundation that would stand the test of time. And as long as there were people willing to stand up for what was right, there would always be hope for a better, more just world. A few more years passed, and Ryan Carter's career had reached heights he never imagined when he first joined the force. Now, as the chief of police, Ryan was responsible not only for the reforms that had already taken place, but also for leading the department through new social, technological, and ethical challenges. His success as a reformer had made him a widely respected figure, but it had also placed him under intense scrutiny. Every move he made, every decision he authorized, was dissected by the media and the public. The new debate consuming the city was centered around the rise in community-led safety initiatives. Many neighborhoods, particularly those that had experienced tense relations with the police in the past, were advocating for more localized, community-based public safety programs. These initiatives emphasized conflict resolution, mental health intervention, and restorative justice over traditional policing methods. Ryan understood the community's desire to have a more direct role in keeping their neighborhoods safe. After all, much of the progress they had made over the years was due to increased collaboration between the police and the public. But there were concerns within the department about the implications of scaling back traditional policing in favor of untested community models. One afternoon, as Ryan sat reviewing proposals for community-led initiatives, his deputy, Lieutenant Denise Martin, walked into his office. Denise had been one of Ryan's strongest allies during the reform years, helping him navigate the pushback from the old guard while building support among the rank-and-file officers. "Chief, you've seen the latest push from the city council, right?" Denise asked, a hint of concern in her voice. Ryan nodded, gesturing for her to take a seat. "Yeah, I've been going over it. Community Safety Initiative, they're calling it. They want to divert some funding from the police budget to support it." Denise frowned. "I get where they're coming from, but are they really ready for this? We're talking about removing traditional law enforcement presence in some of the most at-risk neighborhoods. Are we setting them up to fail?" Ryan leaned back in his chair, thinking carefully before responding. "I don't think we should look at it as us versus them. The goal is the same: keeping people safe. The way we've done things isn't the only way to do it. But if we're going to make this work, we need to be partners in the process." Denise nodded, her expression softening. "You think we can pull that off?" Ryan smiled slightly. "We've done harder things." A few days later, Ryan met with Councilwoman Elena Reyes, one of the main architects of the Community Safety Initiative. The two had worked together closely on previous reforms, but this new initiative was pushing them into uncharted territory. Still, Ryan was determined to keep the lines of communication open. Chief Carter, Councilwoman Reyes, greeted him warmly as they sat down in her office. "Thank you for taking the time. I know this isn't an easy conversation." Ryan smiled. "That's why we're here to have the hard conversations. We both want the same thing: safer communities." Reyes nodded, her tone more serious now. "Exactly. But we believe that safety doesn't always have to come from a police presence. These community programs have been shown to reduce violence and increase trust between residents. We want to give people the tools to resolve conflicts without always having to rely on law enforcement." Ryan took a deep breath. "I understand that, and I think there's a lot of potential here. But we also need to make sure that when people call for help, they get the response they need. There are situations where trained law enforcement is necessary, when violence escalates or when people's lives are at risk. We can't ignore that reality." Reyes leaned forward, her eyes thoughtful. "That's why we need your help. We're not talking about eliminating police presence, we're talking about complementing it. Working together with the community instead of always being the first line of defense." Ryan nodded. "I'm open to that. Let's figure out how we can build this partnership. But we need clear guidelines on when the police should step in and when the community can handle things on their own. We also need to make sure that officers aren't feeling like they're being sidelined." If we're going to shift some of the responsibility, we need to bring everyone to the table. Reyes smiled. That's exactly what I was hoping to hear. Over the next few months, the Community Safety Initiative took shape. Ryan and his team worked closely with the City Council and community leaders to design a pilot program that would test the new model in several neighborhoods. The initiative focused on training community members in conflict resolution, mental health first aid, and de-escalation tactics, while keeping a close line of communication with the police for situations that required their involvement. Jordan, ever the advocate for grassroots solutions, was thrilled with the progress. "This is exactly what we've been talking about for years," Jordan said one evening over dinner with Ryan. "Empowering the community to take ownership of their own safety. If this works, it could be a game changer." Ryan nodded, though he remained cautious. "I want it to work as much as you do. But we have to be prepared for things to go wrong, too. If the community doesn't feel supported, or if the police feel like they're being cut out of the process, this could backfire." Jordan raised his glass. "That's why we have you keeping everyone on the same page." Ryan chuckled, clinking his glass against Jordan's. "Let's hope it's enough." As the program rolled out, there were successes and setbacks. In some neighborhoods, the community-led safety efforts resulted in a noticeable decrease in calls for police intervention. People began resolving disputes among themselves, and trust between residents and law enforcement improved. But in other areas, old tensions resurfaced. Some officers felt their authority was being undermined, while certain residents still feared police involvement, leading to hesitations in calling for help when it was really needed. Ryan worked tirelessly to address these issues, meeting with officers and community leaders, adjusting the program as needed. He knew this was part of the growing pains of any new initiative, but he also knew they couldn't afford to let the early successes slip away. The true test of the Community Safety Initiative came one night when a major confrontation erupted between two rival groups in one of the pilot neighborhoods. The conflict had escalated quickly, with rumors of violence spreading through social media. Normally, the police would have responded immediately, but this time, the community leaders who had been trained through the initiative decided to step in first. Ryan and his team were on standby, monitoring the situation closely. He had already instructed the officers to be ready to intervene if things got out of hand. But he was hoping that the community could de-escalate the situation without the need for force. For hours, tensions ran high as the trained mediators worked to calm both sides. The situation was touch and go, but just as things seemed like they were about to erupt into violence, a breakthrough happened. The leaders of both groups agreed to meet, with the mediators acting as go-betweens, and after a tense negotiation, they reached a resolution without a single arrest or injury. When Ryan received the call that the situation had been resolved peacefully, he felt a wave of relief wash over him. "We did it," Denise said, her voice filled with awe as she stood beside Ryan in the precinct's command center. Ryan nodded, his expression serious. "The community did it. We were there to back them up, but they handled it on their own." Jordan called Ryan that night, excited about the news. "This is huge, man, proof that this model works. People are going to take notice." Ryan smiled but remained grounded. "It's a big step, but we have to stay focused. This isn't a one-time thing. We need to keep refining the process, making sure that both the community and the police are working together." Months later, the success of the pilot program had attracted national attention. Cities across the country were interested in replicating the model, and Ryan was once again at the forefront of a new wave of reform. This time, the focus wasn't just on how police could change, but on how entire communities could take ownership of their safety while still collaborating with law enforcement. Jordan, as always, remained by Ryan's side, helping to push the legal framework for these initiatives across the country. The two friends had come a long way from that fateful night they had been pulled over. Their partnership had transformed the city and was now shaping the future of public safety nationwide. As Ryan sat in his office preparing for yet another interview with a national news outlet about the program's success, he couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. The road hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead. But they had built something lasting, something that would change lives for generations to come. Looking out the window at the city he had dedicated his life to, Ryan smiled. The work was never done, but for the first time, he felt truly optimistic about the future. They had started with a fight for justice, but now they were building a future of hope, partnership, and community-led safety. And as long as people were willing to work together, Ryan knew that anything was possible. A few years had passed since the Community Safety Initiative had been fully implemented across the city. The initiative had matured, becoming an example of how community and law enforcement could work together in harmony without one undermining the other. While there were still challenges, the overwhelming success had drawn attention from policymakers, activists, and law enforcement agencies across the country. Ryan Carter, now nearing retirement age, was in a reflective mood. After decades of service, he knew his time as the city's police chief was coming to an end. And while he looked forward to stepping back from the pressures of the job, he also felt the weight of leaving behind a legacy. Jordan, meanwhile, had taken his advocacy work to a national level. He was now leading efforts to pass federal legislation aimed at reshaping policing standards across the United States. They were both busy men, but their friendship remained as strong as ever. One evening, as Ryan sat at his kitchen table going over the plans for his final year in office, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Jordan Need to talk. "Big news! Let's meet tomorrow." Ryan smiled to himself. Jordan always had big news. Over the years, they had shared so many victories, setbacks, and countless moments of celebration and frustration. But it was their shared vision that had kept them moving forward. The next day, Ryan met Jordan at a small diner they used to frequent in their early days as young professionals. It felt nostalgic, sitting in the same booth where they had once dreamed of making a difference. Now, years later, they had done more than dream, they had transformed their city. "All right, Jordan, what's this big news?" Ryan asked as he settled into the booth. Jordan leaned forward, his eyes bright with excitement. "I've been talking with some of the top people in Washington. They want to take what we've done here with the Community Safety Initiative and turn it into a national pilot program. It'll be the first time this kind of community-driven public safety model has been tested on such a large scale." Ryan sat back, absorbing the news. "National pilot program? That's huge. What's the plan?" Jordan nodded enthusiastically. "They're looking for cities willing to try it. We'd take the model we built and expand it, tweaking it based on the unique needs of different communities. They want to bring me on as a national advisor, but more importantly, they want your input." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "My input? I'm about to retire, Jordan. I'm not sure I'm the guy for this." Jordan shook his head, a grin spreading across his face. "You're exactly the guy for this. You've seen this work on the ground. You've lived it. And the fact that you've been in law enforcement gives you the credibility to convince other departments that this isn't just some idealistic dream, it's real. And it works." Ryan rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "It's a big ask. I've spent my entire career in this city. I'm not sure I'm ready for something on that scale." Jordan leaned in, his voice quieter now. "I know you're ready to step back, but think about it. This could be the final piece of the puzzle scaling this idea across the country. You could retire knowing that what we built here is making an impact everywhere. Just give it some thought." Ryan didn't respond immediately, but he knew Jordan had a point. The work they had started in their city had the potential to be something even greater. But after years of leading a department, Ryan wasn't sure if he had the energy for another national fight. "You'll think about it," Ryan said finally, his tone cautious. Jordan smiled. "That's all I'm asking." As Ryan approached the end of his tenure as police chief, he began preparing his department for the transition. He had mentored several officers who were strong candidates to succeed him, including Lieutenant Denise Martin, who had proven herself to be a capable leader and a dedicated advocate for the community-first approach they had built. One afternoon, Ryan called Denise into his office. "Denise, you've been one of the strongest leaders in this department for years," Ryan said, looking across his desk at her. "I've been thinking a lot about the future, and I believe you're ready to take the reins." Denise's eyes widened slightly, though she had suspected this moment was coming. Chief, that means a lot. I've learned so much from you, and I believe in what we've built together. But I know there's still so much more to do. Ryan nodded, his face thoughtful. That's exactly why I know you're the right person for this. You've always been driven by the same things that pushed me: justice, fairness, and a commitment to serving the people. This department needs someone like you to keep it moving forward. Denise sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Ryan's words settling on her shoulders. Thank you, Chief. I won't let you down. I know you won't, Ryan said, his voice filled with quiet confidence. And remember, you're not doing this alone. Lean on your team, and don't be afraid to keep pushing for change, even when it's hard. As Denise left the office, Ryan felt a sense of peace. The future of the department was in good hands. It was time for him to step back and let the next generation lead. With his retirement officially announced, Ryan took a few weeks to reflect on Jordan's proposal. The idea of taking the community safety initiative to a national level intrigued him, but he was also ready for a quieter life after years of public service. He spent more time with his family, enjoying the slower pace, but the thought of leaving the work behind nagged at him. One evening, Ryan found himself sitting on his back porch, the sun setting over the city skyline. The phone buzzed, and he saw a message from Jordan. Still waiting on you, old man. Time's ticking. Ryan chuckled to himself, shaking his head. Jordan never gave up on a fight. That night, Ryan made his decision. He wasn't ready to walk away from it all just yet. The work they had started was too important, and if there was a chance to make a lasting impact on a national scale, he wanted to be a part of it. The next morning, Ryan called Jordan. All right, I'm in. Let's do this. Jordan's voice was filled with triumph. I knew you couldn't resist. This is going to be big, Ryan. We're about to change the game. With the decision made, Ryan found himself in Washington, D.C., meeting with lawmakers, community leaders, and law enforcement officials from across the country. The national pilot program was being rolled out in 10 major cities, and Ryan was instrumental in helping to shape its implementation. His experience in building the initiative from the ground up gave him a unique perspective, and his input was invaluable as they adapted the program to fit the specific needs of different communities. Jordan, as always, was right there with him, leading the charge from the legal side and ensuring that the program stayed true to its original goals of fairness, justice, and community empowerment. As the months passed, Ryan found himself energized by the work. He had thought he was ready for retirement, but this new mission gave him a renewed sense of purpose. The challenges were immense, but so were the rewards.
He watched his communities begin to embrace the new model as officers and residents, and as the seeds of change spread from city to city.
2 years into the national pilot program, the results were undeniable. The Community Safety Initiative had reduced violent incidents, built stronger bonds between law enforcement and residents, and empowered communities to take control of their own safety. The program was hailed as a success, and plans were already underway to expand it to even more cities. Ryan, now in his mid-60s, knew it was finally time to step back for good. His work was done. He had helped lay the foundation for a new era of policing and community collaboration, and he had no doubt that the leaders who followed would continue to build on that legacy. As he stood on the steps of the Capitol, watching the latest round of national reforms being signed into law, Ryan felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had spent his life fighting for justice, for fairness, and for a better future. And now that future was being realized. Jordan stood beside him, grinning. Well, old man, we did it. Ryan smiled, his eyes reflecting both pride and relief. Yeah, we did. They stood there together, watching the crowds below, knowing that their fight had been worth it. The road had been long, the challenges immense, but they had built something lasting, something that would shape the future for generations to come. And in that moment, Ryan knew that while his journey as a public servant was over, his legacy of justice, reform, and hope would live on. Ryan Carter had officially retired from his role as chief of police and had successfully completed his work on the national pilot program. Now, standing on the balcony of his home in Denver, He gazed out over the city that had shaped his life. After decades of service, he was finally stepping away from the day-to-day grind of law enforcement. But it didn't feel like the end. In many ways, it felt like a new beginning. Without the constant pressures of his old position, Ryan found himself reconnecting with old hobbies and passions that he hadn't had time for in years. He spent more time with his family, his wife Elena, and their two grown children, Tyler and Sophia. The past few years had been especially hard on them, with Ryan's intense focus on work, and now he wanted to make up for lost time. One sunny afternoon, Ryan and Elena took a walk through the park, something they hadn't done in what felt like ages. The air was crisp, the leaves falling gently around them, and Ryan felt a sense of peace that he hadn't experienced in years. "You finally have time to slow down," Elena said with a smile as they strolled along the path. Ryan nodded. "It feels strange, but it's nice. I think I forgot what it was like to just be present." Elena squeezed his hand. "You've earned it, but I have a feeling you're not done yet." Ryan smiled, knowing she was right. Even in retirement, his mind still buzzed with thoughts about how he could continue making a difference. But this time, he would do it on his terms, without the constant demands of his old job weighing him down. A few months into his retirement, Ryan was approached by a local university to teach a course on ethical leadership and policing reform. The idea intrigued him. He had spent years putting these principles into practice, but now he had the opportunity to pass that knowledge on to the next generation of leaders. The thought of stepping into a classroom full of eager students, young people, who would one day be responsible for shaping the future of law enforcement, gave Ryan a renewed sense of purpose. He accepted the offer and began preparing for the course. On his first day at the university, Ryan felt a twinge of nervousness as he walked into the lecture hall. The students sat quietly, some of them looking excited, others curious, all waiting for the former police chief who had gained national recognition for his reforms. "Good afternoon," Ryan began, standing at the front of the class. "My name is Ryan Carter, and am here to talk to you about the future of policing." He paused, scanning the room before continuing. "But before we talk about the future, we need to understand the past, the mistakes, the challenges, and the moments when we didn't get it right. Because if we don't learn from those moments, we'll be doomed to repeat them." The room was silent as Ryan spoke, but he could feel the students' attention. Their interest piqued. Over the course of the semester, Ryan shared not just the victories he'd had in his career, but the hard lessons he had learned along the way. He emphasized the importance of empathy, listening, and above all, the responsibility that comes with the badge. Teaching gave Ryan a new outlet for his energy and passion. It wasn't the adrenaline-filled, high-stakes work of policing, but it was just as important. These students were the future, and he was determined to equip them with the tools they needed to lead with integrity. While Ryan was settling into his new role as an educator, Jordan Thompson's star continued to rise. His work on the national level had gained him a reputation as one of the most respected voices in the fight for justice reform. Jordan had helped pass landmark legislation that put ethical limits on the use of surveillance technology, created national standards for police accountability, and expanded community-led safety programs across the country. One afternoon, Jordan called Ryan from his office in Washington, D.C., and with some unexpected news. "Ryan, guess what?" Jordan said, his voice buzzing with excitement. "They want me to run for office." Ryan chuckled. "Who's they? And what office are we talking about here?" Jordan laughed. "A group of people who've been following my work think I should run for Congress. They want me to take this fight from the courtroom to the Capitol." Ryan wasn't entirely surprised. Jordan had always been a fighter, and he had the kind of charisma and conviction that made him a natural leader. "I can't say I didn't see this coming. Are you thinking about it?" "I am," Jordan admitted. "It's a huge responsibility, but I've been thinking about how much more we could accomplish with the right people in power. If I can push for change at the highest level, why not go for it?" Ryan nodded, though Jordan couldn't see it. "You've always said we need people inside the system to change it from within. This might be your chance to do just that." "I've been thinking the same thing," Jordan replied. It's a big step, but I think it's the right one." As they talked, Ryan felt a deep sense of pride for his friend. Jordan had spent his life fighting for justice, and now he was on the verge of taking that fight to the national stage. The following year, Jordan launched his campaign for Congress. With his years of legal experience and his proven track record in reform, he quickly gained support from a wide range of voters. His platform focused on criminal justice reform, civil rights, and economic equality issues that had been central to his work for decades. Ryan, though retired, was actively involved in the campaign, offering advice and helping Jordan connect with key community leaders. He traveled with Jordan to campaign events, standing by his side as they continued to push for the changes they had always believed in. On the night of the election, Ryan sat in the campaign's headquarters, surrounded by Jordan's team, watching the results roll in. The energy in the room was electric, but Ryan remained calm, reflecting on everything they had accomplished together. When the final votes were tallied, it was official: Jordan had won the election. The room erupted into cheers, and Jordan was immediately swarmed by supporters and media. But as soon as he had a moment, Jordan made his way through the crowd to Ryan. "We did it, man," Jordan said, grinning from ear to ear. Ryan smiled, shaking his friend's hand before pulling him into a hug. "You did it! I'm proud of you." Jordan nodded, his expression turning serious for a moment. "None of this would have happened without you, Ryan. We've been in this together from the start." As the celebration continued, Ryan couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning of something even bigger. Jordan's election to Congress meant that the work they had started years ago, the fight for justice, fairness, and accountability, was now being carried forward on a national level. And while Ryan was stepping back, he knew that the movement would continue to grow, led by people like Jordan, who were ready to take the next steps. As Ryan watched Jordan deliver his victory speech later that night, he felt a sense of closure and fulfillment. The work they had done together had made a lasting impact, not just in their city, but across the country. They had faced countless obstacles, but through it all, they had never given up. Ryan's life was quieter now, but it was filled with meaning. His time teaching at the university continued to bring him joy, and the students he mentored were already starting to make waves in the fields of law enforcement, social justice, and community activism. His influence would live on through them, and through the work Jordan was doing on a national scale. In the end, Ryan realized that the fight for justice never truly ended. It was passed down from one generation to the next, evolving with each new challenge. But he took comfort in knowing that the work would continue long after he was gone. And as he looked toward the future, Ryan Carter was filled with hope that the lessons they had learned, the battles they had fought, and the progress they had made would lead to a world that was fairer, more just, and filled with opportunity for all. As the story draws to a close, we want to thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of justice, friendship, and change. If you enjoyed this story and want more thought-provoking content like this, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us continue sharing stories that inspire, challenge, and make a difference. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update, and feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear where you're watching from and what impact this story had on you. Subscribe now for more impactful stories and content that makes you think. We value your feedback, so if you enjoyed this story, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for being part of our storytelling community, and stay tuned for more stories that remind us all that no matter how hard things get, we are never truly alone.